Hey everyone, thanks for joining us today. I'm Xavier Harding. I'm on the content team here at Mozilla. This is the first time I've ever worn a blazer with pajama pants, but here we are. We've got a fantastic panel for you today. We know a lot of you are still working from home, researching from home, networking from home, etc. And some of you aren't. If your job has you out and about right now, we greatly appreciate you, and they should pay you a lot more. Many of the events that the internet health movement looks forward to each year have been canceled or postponed. That's why Mozilla has made its dialogues and debates, the speaker series of MozFest, virtual. It's a chance to continue the important conversations about online privacy, trustworthy AI, big tech, and similar topics. So today's virtual dialogues and debates will be about the protests, the pandemic, and misinformation. We'll be discussing the ways fake news spreads across platforms, especially against the backdrop of COVID-19 and the Black Lives Matter movement protests. We've seen this problem all around the web. We've seen Facebook posts about secret cures. We've seen viral videos on YouTube claiming the pandemic is a giant conspiracy. We've seen tweets resurfacing old videos of violent protests, pretending that they're newer videos. So over the next 40 minutes, I'm going to talk to 3 experts about this: what's causing it, what the consequences are, and how we might fix it. So joining me today are Julia Lono. Julie is the Executive Director of Internet Without Borders and Fellow at the Berkman Klein Center for Internet and Society. We have Dia Kajali. They are the Tech and Advocacy Program Manager at Witness.org, an organization that uses video and tech to protect and defend human rights. We have Nima Ayur. Nima is the founder of the civic technology company Policy, based in Uganda. Nima is also a Mozilla Creative Media Award winner. Congrats on that. Camille Francois, Chief Innovation Officer at Graphica and Mozilla Fellow. Camille studies cyber conflict and digital rights online. And one last thing to keep in mind, we're also taking questions on Twitter for this panel in real time. So make sure to tweet at Mozilla and use the hashtag dialogues and debates. So let's get started. How are you guys feeling?
Pretty good.
All right.
Nice. That's good. Dia, I want to start with you. Before we go any further, I want to clarify some of the real world impact fake news pieces have been having on the real world. Can you give us kind of like an example of that?
Yeah, so I'll give you one really clear example and one somewhat less clear example. Just to preface it, of course, sometimes the link between content online and what's happening offline is a little bit less clear. Sometimes it's more clear. And unfortunately, in recent years, as we've seen people get more and more skilled at deploying mis and disinformation, that link has become more clear. So one really disturbing example that I want to talk about is the hashtag Corona Jihad and the kind of content that has been going out under that hashtag and with that sort of content. And for anybody who's interested in what I'm talking about, I strongly urge you to check out Equality Lab's report on Corona Jihad, as well as all the work that they've been doing about it. And the examples that I've seen have come from them. For people who haven't heard of this, this is a campaign saying that Muslims are purposefully spreading Corona. It's pointed to a religious gathering that happened in India, and it's happening around a time when we've already seen a lot of mis and disinformation being used to target that community. So claims that, for example, Muslims are handing out birth control. Before Corona Jihad, there was the Love Jihad hashtag saying that Muslims are purposefully converting Hindus and getting them to marry as a way to get rid of Hindus in the country. And all of these things are leading very directly to violence. They're leading to lynchings, so people being either beaten or actually killed by angry mobs, people's homes and stores being burnt down, all sorts of very real violence. So that's one where the link is quite clear. Unfortunately, there's been a lot of research done around it, and we can see the link between that content and where so-called communal violence springs up. Another somewhat more attenuated example, but it's very timely. So I believe it was this month or late last month, there was a family that was camping in Washington State, and they were surrounded by a group of people who said, "You're Antifa, and get out of here." And they were actually followed by people with semi-automatic weapons. And this is a rumor that's been going around in conservative circles. It's been supported by content on Twitter, on Facebook, about how, first of all, about what Antifa is, but more importantly, that they're actually going to small towns to try to perpetuate their work, right? So I just wanted to give that example because I want to make it really clear that it's not just about places outside of the US. It's not happening in just one place. This content does have very real world effects. And in this case, it was people being chased out of their camping trip and followed by people with guns drawn.
That's absolutely crazy. And I was actually hoping to kind of go around the table, the proverbial table, where everyone can kind of surface one piece of misinformation, disinformation, fake news that they've seen during this pandemic, during these protests that have just been kind of absolutely wild. I know for myself, I saw the news that there were 5G, that people thought 5G towers were causing coronavirus. And it's kind of crazy that that caught on. What are some of the things you all have been seeing? And I'll start with Camille.
Julie, you wanted to say something? I saw Rachel hand.
Well, I'll link that to the content that I've seen to see the offline violence that could come out of it.
Okay, then I'll weave my comments with what Dia was just discussing, which is what's interesting from my perspective is not so much new content from scratch that's suddenly talking about COVID-19, but a lot of conspiracy theories or hate movements that were previously focused on other targets and other narratives that suddenly get a fresh, coat of paint to become COVID-19 conspiracy theories or COVID-19 hate movements. So Corona Jihad is a great example of that. Other examples that are more conspiratorial, for instance, include the conspiracy theories that the Gates Foundation is working towards depopulating the earth, and this is why they had invented climate change. Now we see that conspiracy theory become, this is why they have created COVID-19. All of this, of course, is inaccurate, but it's, for me, what the dynamic that's interesting here is sort of the recycling of previous movements, narratives, to make them COVID-19 relevant.
Nice. And then Julie, do you want to go next?
Yes, I completely agree with what Camille just said, how, conspiracies conspiracy networks which had pre-existed to the pandemic are also trying to take advantage of this moment. And I would like to jump on what Camille just shared. I had one fake news that I really often came across on the web, and particularly on WhatsApp. And I'm sure it will be familiar to many people like me who are member of family groups, especially in Africa. I'm from Cameroon. And the family groups were flooded with disinformation, and it became our job to try to debunk that. So it was a huge task. But one disinformation that I came across, and I think is a good example of how serious this is this idea. So there was an info going around saying that Melinda Gates was divorcing Bill Gates because she was disagreeing on how he was using their foundation to spread the disease and later fund a vaccine that would affect African populations and basically reduce the populations in Africa. That was particularly disgusting and absolutely untrue, and it was actually debunked by many media, including PesaCheck, which is a network of fact checkers, and also by newspapers in the French-speaking sphere, particularly 20 Minutes, so the daily, free newspaper. But why that comparison was particularly interesting and had actually real world effects is that it came at a moment where there was another controversy. So I don't know if you remember that, but on a very famous French TV show, there were doctors who were discussing the response to the COVID, and one of the doctors made very unfortunate comments on whether or not we should test vaccines on populations in Africa. And obviously people reacted against that and were against that. But the fact that it came at the same time as these comparisons were going around, it gave echo definitely to that, and it was even more difficult to debunk. And it did have real world consequences. I remember, for instance, the info about a center of testing, which was destroyed in a suburb of Abidjan in Côte d'Ivoire, and it reminds of other episodes of disinformation and epidemic, and this time Ebola, how disinformation has made it very difficult at the beginning for doctors and public health officials to bring responses to the Ebola crisis, because doctors were chased and there was a distrust against them. So yeah, it does have real world consequences.
Yeah, that's a good point. Nima.
Yeah, I'd like to talk about fake news or ridiculous fake news that is spread by actual members of government, because these are your leaders and you're expected to trust them. And then what do you do in the situations where they are the ones who are spreading this kind of fake news? And taking the example of East Africa, we saw President Magufuli of Tanzania suggested that steam inhalation could either cure you or prevent you from getting coronavirus. The governor of Nairobi had actually packages for people because he said that consuming alcohol would prevent you from getting coronavirus or would help you to recover. And so what that can do in terms of alcohol consumption, that's a real world danger about people going and suffering from alcohol intoxication. And I think the biggest story that really stood out for me when this first happened was the Speaker of Parliament in Uganda. She had posted this video along with the president and this scientist and his company saying that they had the cure to coronavirus. And it was always fluctuating between cure or vaccine. And that this man from the US had given the patent to Uganda to start production in 2 weeks. So Uganda was going to have this vaccine cure in 2 weeks, and people across social media really lost it. Like half the camp was like, this is nonsense. Like, there's a process to have a vaccine. You have to test it. Even the Ministry of Health was like, what's going on? And then the other camp was like, no, this is our time to shine. We've done it. We have a vaccine. But of course, later on, it turned out to be a sanitizer, not a cure. And so, but I mean, this misinformation, like it was everywhere, and it was giving people a lot of hope. This was in early March that we had the cure for coronavirus in Uganda, and this is all from our leaders from across these countries. And I think that's a big problem when your leaders are giving you wrong information. And how do you start to dispel that from this starting point? So
yeah, I know this is a very serious topic, but I just want to pause and say you guys have the best virtual backgrounds, I think, of any dialogue debates panel. You're in a starship right now. That's fantastic. Yeah, these examples feel high stakes. My question is, will any of this finally change? Because this can't keep on going like this, can it?
No, I'll jump in. All right. I don't know if it was addressed to someone, but of course this can go on forever. And obviously, I think we're talking about the responsibilities in the spread, or at least in the visibility of these theories. And obviously, platforms are, in my opinion, the primary responsibles. I'm working particularly in places of the world where all these platforms are eager to scale. That's a new thing. Obviously, trying to tap into potentially, especially for the African continent, potentially 1 billion consumers. That's how they're perceived. I consider them citizens and users first, but for some, they are consumers. But you can do, and most of these platforms do that without the necessary safeguards. They don't ask themselves about what are do these countries have a functioning judiciary, first of all, or do these countries have a functioning public force that's not used primarily against citizens, but that's used actually to do its work, which is to make sure the security is a reality for everyone. So I feel like these platforms do have a responsibility not only to scale, but also to ask themselves about the political responsibility they have when they put their feet in places where all the safeguards do not exist like they do in other nations, let's say the US or Europe, where even if the political power won't do anything, at least there is a very strong civil society, and there are other counterpowers that can jump in. So, but beyond that, obviously, beyond the platforms, governments do have a responsibility as well. And I fear that the less we try to deal with these issues of disinformation, and which can therefore become hate speech, can be used to foster hate speech and sow, distrust among populations. Some governments are using that to say, hey, you see Twitter and Facebook and WhatsApp, they're sowing hatred in our country, so we need to shut them down. And that's what increasingly governments are doing, and they're doing that, I would say, almost increasingly with impunity, because obviously nobody agrees with having your country or your online space being filled with disinformation and all this. But yeah, I think it can go on because it's dangerous for free expression, ultimately, for security, of course, but ultimately for free expression.
Yeah. Yeah, you mentioned Africa earlier in your answer, and it made me think about, we have seen many examples of, many prominent examples of fake news and misinformation regarding coronavirus, but the examples of fake news regarding George Floyd and the Black Lives Matter movement may not be as prominent. So for Nima, for Julie, how are people in other places kind of perceiving the Black Lives Matter movement, perceiving the George Floyd news? Are we seeing fake news around those things as well?
Yeah, I'd like to just jump in and, if we're, of course, Africa is not a country, but, speaking from the point of view of the African Union, they put out a statement strongly condemning the murder of George Floyd, and they affirmed their rejection of, discriminatory practices in the US. And coincidentally, George Floyd was killed on Africa Day. And Africa Day is an annual commemoration of what would eventually become the African Union. And it's so ironic because it's a day to celebrate progress, to celebrate freedom from colonization, from segregation. And so people from across the continent watched all of this happening in real time, and it was absolutely horrific. Like, I felt like I couldn't sleep for 2 weeks, seeing this military response, seeing how journalists were being treated, and it was horrific. It was horrific to see that this is the way that people were being treated in the US, because there's different layers to this. Western nations, especially the US, they play this paternalistic role in African countries through their diplomacy and through their aid programs. And now we're watching in real time as these countries unravel and show us all these things that they came to preach to us for all these years. And, when it comes to their own country, they take a totally different response, and they have this really, really violent response. But at the same time, African countries have been doing these atrocities against their own citizens, and the AU has remained silent. Whatever country we're talking about, DRC, Nigeria, Cameroon. And yes, no society is perfect, but we're all in this struggle for safety, freedom, dignity of Black people, of Africans. And this raises really important questions because, firstly, what moral authority does the US have as a world leader? But the other scary part is, does this embolden African leaders to justify their own violence at home? Or does this become a turning point for us to look at justice in a different lens and to look at reconciliation, for citizens across Africa? So I think for me, this has been a big turning point, and it was absolutely terrifying watching all this, and it's still happening. And seeing what the response is, it's just a slap in the face, I feel.
Yeah.
If I could just rapidly, I totally share Nima's feeling. And I would like to add a layer to that. We saw how the Black Lives Matter movement is echoing beyond the US borders in Latin America and in Europe and beyond. And particularly in the case of Europe, I was very interested in how it has impacted even debate on police violence in another country that I know very well, which is France, and particularly the case of a young man who's dead now, named Adama Traoré, who was killed, who died while being in police custody. And it has resonated, and it has given visibility to that struggle, which was until very recently, kept at the margins and perceived by some in the opinions, and particularly the far right opinion, as an argument made by people who want to launch a race war in France or stuff like that, which are absolutely not true. It's really about justice. It's the sister of this man, Assad Traoré, is now asking for justice in the name of their family. So I felt like there was an interesting transnational. That's a concept that one of my colleagues here at the Berkman introduced me to, Leonard Kotana. He's really about, we are on the internet, so it's an infrastructure that's interdependent. We're all on the same network, and one action somewhere impacts an action elsewhere. And yeah, the George Floyd protest movement really showed that one thing can happen in Minneapolis, and a week later, the case of Adama Traoré is reopened and looked at with another lens. That was very powerful, I think.
Yeah, it's great. I mean, sometimes it's hard to think about fake news when the real news is just so bad and tragic. But one thing I think about, or one thing that I want to ask you guys, internet users in low resource environments can be more vulnerable to misinformation. Are there tools or resources we're developing to kind of combat that?
Sure, I can take this one. Yeah, I've always felt that knowledge is power, access to information is the key to education. But from what we're seeing about the spread of conspiracy theories, it seems to really not be the case. And countries across Africa have internet subscription rates of anywhere from 10%, if we're looking at, for example, Chad, all the way up to 80%. So there's a large, millions of people who are going to come onto the internet for the first time. Africa has about 1.5 billion people. And, we think that if you've never been on the internet, you're more likely to be susceptible to believing fake information. Like I had the example of a friend, this is actually in our podcast, where she was talking to one of her staff about YouTube, and her staff basically thought that, YouTube was like traditional media. You had to be someone vetted to make a YouTube video. You had to be someone serious. And my friend explained, no, you can make a YouTube video. Anyone can upload on YouTube. And, it just totally blew her mind. What? This is anyone off the street talking on YouTube? And so this basic digital literacy is, really important in helping people to understand mis and disinformation. And in answering your question, what's being done, just to talk about our creative award with Mozilla, we launched a game called Choose Your Own Fake News, and we're trying to use a different approach to get people to scrutinize the information that they receive by, very much related to this conversation, by showing that fake news has real world implications. Every time you send that forward, every time you spread this information, what is actually happening? How does that actually affect your society? And we wanted to use this game aspect so that we're not being preachy, or we're not writing long reports that no one's going to read. And we really wanted it to reach people who are coming on the internet for the first time. But if I'm to really answer your question, what is being done? I think too little is being done. I'm just not seeing enough. There's fact checking, but you check after the matter has happened, and after all the buzz is gone and no one really cares anymore. Or the other issue is, even if you want to fact check, how are you fact checking local languages? In Uganda, we have over 100 languages. We do not have that kind of funding to go and see what every community radio is speaking or what are they saying. And then, of course, on that topic, there's a very thin line between freedom of expression and repression of dissenting voices. And we have to really toe that line delicately. So overall, I think we have so much work to do in educating people about misinformation. And coming back to the original question, what do you do when the misinformation is by your leaders, who are the ones who would have programs to teach you about misinformation? So lots and lots of work to be done.
Yeah, I want to switch gears a little bit, because I think we have to talk about what happened yesterday. It's a little tangential to fake news, but it has to do with what we see online. So Trump had a bad day yesterday. We saw Twitch take him down. We saw his sections of Reddit kind of taken down. We saw YouTube ban some of his supporters like David Duke and Richard Spencer. I feel like, Camille, you definitely have thoughts. Dia, you definitely have thoughts. My question is, why is this happening like in the 11th hour of his presidency? It feels like he's going to be out tomorrow. Why do they wait till now to start doing this?
Yeah, I think it's related to what Julie and Nima were just talking about, right? Like, in some ways, we're at a really interesting and important pivotal moment in how we navigate content moderation on the internet, because on the one hand, we're exposed to sort of how nefarious, how bad, how violent disinformation can be, but we're also reminded that online activism is sometimes a wonderful force for progress, right? We're reminded that you can create global movements for peace and justice. And I think, Xavier, the actual answer to your question, like, why are we seeing this now? I think it's because largely of well-organized campaigns. There's been a successful Stop Hate for Profit campaign. And so we see this pressure sort of get organized and have this conversation with Silicon Valley. I think what we have to ask is, right now is a moment of intense experimentation. We have a lot of like scattershot rules and ad hoc, policies being applied, and a lot of like, oh, we have this problem, so we're going to fix it that way. And we should be asking the questions that Julie put on the table, right? Like, how does that scale? How consistently are we going to apply those new policies? The Reddit statement is really interesting because it talks about the growing gap between their values and their hate speech policies. Are we going to apply this consistently, across the entire political spectrum, but also across all the contexts across the globe? How are we going to create transparency and accountability for people to be able to measure the impact of all these new scattershot sort of ad hoc rules that are being created very rapidly? So I think that we're really at a pivotal moment where we have to sort of like keep our focus and make sure we understand all these new rules, their implications, and we have the transparency and accountability that's necessary to track them and properly evaluate them.
Yeah. Dia, do you have any thoughts on this?
Yeah, actually, this also relates to the question that Nima responded to as well, in terms of sort of why this is happening now, and also how we're solving this problem. Just a second, Camille, I think the reason this is happening now, point blank period, it's because of organizing, and it's because of work that people have done. And I have to say, as someone who has done many various types of organizing over the years, and sort of started off with actually going door to door, talking to people about surveillance, it's really hard to organize around these types of issues, especially when people are facing murder by the police, or lynchings by Islamophobes, or genocide, or all of the things that people are facing. It's really hard for the people who are most affected by this to organize, and it takes bad press, and it takes a lot of attention, and it takes sometimes, unfortunately, these obvious bad results of platforms not doing the right thing. But I still think there's also this real big issue of where the resources are going in our own world, in the nonprofit world, and in the world of activists who are working on this, and also from the companies themselves. How many resources are companies going to put into understanding very dangerous mis and disinformation that is in a language in non-Latin characters, that maybe not that many people speak, not that many. I think the quotation marks are very important, because we have to think about how much money these platforms actually have at their disposal. So, we have to force them to put their resources in the right place, in the same way that the environmental movement had to show that companies that were polluting had to take that into account in their business model. But also, those of us in the nonprofit world, or those of us that are working on fighting this, we need to think about how we're making sure that, for example, those of us who might not always be affected directly by mis and disinformation are making sure that the focus is on the people who are most affected, people who are doing research in their own communities. Like, I would really strongly, urge people, if you're in an institution in the EU or in the US, maybe you're not the person to be doing the research on misinformation in a country in Africa, or misinformation in South Asia or Southeast Asia. Maybe you're not the person actually to be speaking on a panel about it or interviewed for a book. I would really suggest, also in the spirit of the conversation that's happening in the US right now about structural inequality. I mean, it's about anti-Blackness, it's also about a lot of other things. Just ask yourself, like, how can I personally maybe help make this a conversation where the most affected people who understand the problem the best are the voices that are being heard and funded. So, sorry, I know that's a little bit tangential, but I think it really does tie into how we've gotten to this point in the problem, even, if that makes sense.
No, I'm down for tangents. I like the thumbs up from Nima earlier. I hope everyone caught that. Yeah, speaking of like nonprofits, I wanted to talk about, and just like organizations in general, I want to talk about Witness, because I was on the site yesterday and I thought it's so cool what you guys do with like wanting, to get people good with like video and like recording things, and just, it's very important in the world we live in. I feel like I'll be scrolling on Instagram every once in a while, and amongst the George Floyd protests footage and amongst the Black Lives Matter protest footage, every once in a while I'll see a brand share a video of a cop throwing a football to a kid or like handing some little girl ice cream. And I guess it's cool that they did that, but at the same time, I think I am biased, obviously, but it almost feels like they're trying to detract from a larger message. So I want to talk about, where does that fit in the realm of fake news? Because I'm sure that happened. I'm sure that's actually happened, but I've seen people call it propaganda. Like, where does propaganda fit in the whole fake news discussion?
Yeah, and I'll just answer this really quickly because I know I just spoke. So, propaganda is one form of fake news. I think those of us in this field, like when we hear fake news, we're like, oh God, what is that? What are you even talking about? Are you talking about disinformation? Are you talking about misinformation? Are you talking about propaganda? So propaganda is on the spectrum of what we're talking about when we're talking about mis and disinformation. And that stuff, straight up, point blank, it's propaganda. And I think, one of the reasons why Witness exists, not to plug us too much, but one of the reasons we exist is so that people can tell their own stories and working on thinking about effective storytelling. And this is, the whole situation in the US is such a good example where people are telling their own stories and they're saying what they experienced. So of course the response is propaganda, right? And I think that the solutions to propaganda are different, but we do need to think of it as part of the spectrum of fake news.
Yeah.
Go
ahead, Julie.
I just wanted to jump in rapidly and to completely agree with what Dia just said, and saying that, like Camille just introduced her speech by, she said, this is a result of campaigns that have been organizing themselves for years. And I feel that on the other side, so those who are trying to reinform or at least to push back against these manipulations, there needs to be as much organizing, as much awareness around these issues. And obviously there is a competitive disadvantage there, because obviously we have less means. I mean, the good people, we have less means, we have less, so we have to catch up. And I completely agree. One way to go around this is to work with, especially in communities, even in the Western world, in communities which are mostly affected by these problems. Work with them, because when you work with them, when you respect their work, you empower them and you make them agents of reinformation. That's what we did in, we had a project, we have a project since 2018 where we work with human rights defenders, journalists, and bloggers in Western Central Africa. First of all, because when you talk about disinformation, it's not something obvious for everyone. Fake news is not the same fake news for everyone. Some fake news will be it's misinformation, obviously. So there is an importance there to, first of all, help give people the tools, the conceptual tools. I'm not talking about looking on Google image and all this, but the conceptual tools to understand this is not normal. when you see a publication which is, I don't know, incendiary or whatever, there's some things that you have to catch out there and to make your own opinion. And once you give people the tools, they're empowered and they become agents against that, and they understand the importance of doing that work, and they themselves become experts who can then be hired by local other organizations. So yes, it's important to build alliances and to definitely empower. Just to finish on that, I remember a report that was saying that in Germany, for instance, the content by far right movements were amplified. I think, I don't have the stats, sorry, I forget that, but like 100 times more than content from like more moderate parties, political parties in Germany. And the research showed that it's because far right campaigners are organizing even beyond the borders of Germany. So you have people from Hungary amplifying content from German politicians. So yes, there is an asymmetry there that has to be worked on. Sorry, I took a lot of time.
No, it's all good. We're good on time, by the way.
That's because I think Dia made a really, really important point, and I just want to stress like how, like, to put it bluntly, like our ability to fully understand the scope and complexity of disinformation, if the people who are publicly, routinely researching it and exposing it are majority like white and US based, is shot. Like we will not understand this problem properly if we don't discuss the structural issues of the field. And this isn't a new concept, right? Like that's something that comes up all the time in other areas of security. For instance, if you look at cybersecurity, right, they're reckoning for the first time with the fact that most of these cybersecurity incidents that are being exposed are those that target the few people who are funded to be, to be defended, right? Like here, if we consider disinformation also as a security issue, we have to consider the implication of how the field is structured, and therefore how warped our own picture of the issue is going to be as a result. So yeah, just wanted to amplify that message that I think both Dia and Julie made super clearly.
No, I mean, yeah, definitely. Julie, I like how you were talking before about kind of actionable solutions that we could do. So I want to talk kind of more about that, because unfortunately, a lot of the reason this even happens is kind of this user error, human error. Like it's on us, the people sharing this stuff, why this stuff like this catches on. So like, what are some things, maybe like best practices individuals can do to maybe identify and mitigate the spread of misinformation? And anyone can take that. And Anima had to choose your own fake news creative media award-winning app, so maybe Anima knows the answer.
Sorry, what was the last bit you said?
Just like some actionable solutions we can do to stop the spread of misinformation, kind of spot fake news stories.
Yeah. Oh man. Yeah, basically what the game was trying to say was to just scrutinize the news a bit better, like, who sent this message, what's the source, do I need to share it, the very, very basic things. But actually Camille had something way more interesting to say earlier about, who are the actors, and, that it's, putting the onus always on the person who shares, but not really looking at like, who are the content creators, what do they have to benefit, because it's a whole machine, right? Like people benefit financially and socially and in every other way from this fake news. And so only focusing on the individual who shares, I feel, is like looking through a very tiny lens, and it's not a holistic approach to the whole fake thing. Camille, I don't know if you want to jump back in. I thought that was really interesting.
And I realize it's a very tough question. I'm asking you right now to solve fake news on the spot. But yeah, solve fake news on the spot, Camille.
No, I think I really relate to what Nima just said. Like, we have sometimes tendency to put it back on people, right? And at least in my work, I tend to focus more on like, what are the other structural responses? Like, what part of this is not on people? And I think it comes from having spent a lot of time working on foreign interference, for instance, where specific people, specific communities are targeted with really sophisticated campaigns. And then, when you work with people who've been targeted, they always ask you, like, what should I have done differently? When should I have caught this? And in reality, most of the time, like, this is not on them, right? Like, this is a whole of society responsibility. As Julie said, there are a lot of government implications and responsibility there. There's a lot of platform responsibility there. So I'm not at all discounting the important work that's being done on best practices, what people can do, the type of question they can ask. And I think there's great work on this. First drafts have great guides on like how to talk to people around you. Claire Wardle has this great sentence about, like, stop muting your uncle, engage, right? Like, here's the things that you should engage with. But at the same time, a lot of this isn't on individuals and communities online. A lot of this is on more powerful structures, including governments and platforms, to tackle and handle.
And if I can just jump back in, personally, I am so annoyed with YouTube ads. Like, I don't know why this past week have been driving me mad. Like, the double ads at the start of every video I'm so infuriated. But I think that this comes back to the whole structure of the internet based on ads. All of this, like, at least in Uganda, a high proportion of the nonsense I see is clickbait. They just want you to go and click on like, the one that always gets me is, like, Ugandans no longer need visas for the US. That always pops up. I'm like, why would that happen? Why would that be the case? Anyways, it's this whole structure of the internet based on ads, and can we just please have another model of the internet? I'm so sick of it.
I feel like this is the part where I plug Firefox as, like, ad blocking or something. No,
Yeah.
I mean, you're definitely right. Like, you're definitely right. Dia, how does the government stop racist uncles from their crazy racist uncle posts?
The government.
Because it's not just on us. I mean, how do we stop? How do we, period? How do we?
I mean, look, I think if you look at, for example, like Freedom House reports from the last few years, fake news laws are being used to silence people. I don't think, I would be actually really curious if any of my panelists have an example where they've heard of a fake news or misinformation law actually being used to stop really, really dangerous, virulent content that is throwing an election or resulting in the spread of coronavirus or encouraging violence against people. That example may exist, but I have not heard it. I mean, I think in the structure that we're in right now, I think it's, one of the things that I continue to keep trying to do is really get companies to talk to the right people so that they actually understand what they're talking about, who it's affecting, and what they need to do. And so that we can see ultimately if, does Facebook think it's okay if violence happens because of a post? If they're doing it in service of free expression, great, then show us that so that we can know. I mean, it's not great. But platforms are being pushed right now to sort of show their colors. And, I don't think that, unfortunately, I don't think that governments are going to have the solutions to this problem. They might have solutions to companies and how companies operate, but that's a whole different panel, especially, and I want to reiterate, because I know that people have said this, governments are some of the biggest purveyors of some of the most dangerous mis and disinformation out there. So.
Yeah, I mean, going off of that, I think back to yesterday's big day, and the Trump, not playing nice with online services. Like, how do we next time when there's someone in the office like Trump, how do we make sure he doesn't, change doesn't come in the 11th hour, the last minute? Is there anything we can do for that?
If I can jump in, I think it's Rebecca McKinnon who was one of the first who said we need a democracy-based internet, an internet based on democratic principles, with checks and balances included. So even if, because I understand, of course, platforms have to do something, but who makes sure the platform are doing the right thing in the right way? I'm probably not the best placed to talk about how these checks and balances should work, but I hope this is one way, one aspect that is part of the conversation. How can we make sure that anybody who is, considered as part of the answer can be checked by other oversight and other, checks and balances systems, and including governments. When you were discussing earlier the solutions and mentioning regulatory solutions that have been adopted recently by government, of course, all of them are, I call them lame laws, because they just come like too late, and they want to fix rapidly things like magical. You had Facebook to take down content in 24 hours and it's going to solve the problem. Absolutely not. And that's not even me saying that. There was a court, the Constitutional Court of France, recently declared that the newly adopted law, a hate speech law, which was proposed by the government, was unconstitutional, at least in the provisions that asked for platforms to take down content in 24 hours without the oversight of a judge, and threaten them with $250,000 fines every time they don't comply. That's absolutely lame. It doesn't solve the problem. And what's even more lame with this legislation is that they don't work with civil society organizations, which are the ones, we are the ones who have been seeing all these problems for years, even before it became a thing after Trump was elected. So I think we have a clue on what does hate and disinformation look like in the different settings where we work. And that's something that's missing from the conversation. Usually what governments will do is that they will wake up and they will say, we need to regulate. So we're going to Simone, Facebook, Twitter, and we're going to decide. A bit like, I was part of that, and that's why I think I can criticize a bit like what happened with the Christchurch call, which was convened by the French and the New Zealand government. And there was a lot of frustration on the place that was given, at least at the beginning, to civil society organizations. We were just, I felt like I was just for, to say that we consulted at some point with them. So that was very frustrating. And I hope governments that want to regulate on that will give more place and give more credit to what organizations, and not only organizations, citizens and experts, have to say on these matters. The other thing that could be one way to go about this as a solution is, so platforms rely on automated content moderation. And we've seen that very strikingly with the COVID crisis, since all the human moderators were asked to stay home like everybody else. And the problem with moderation, automated moderation, is of course automated moderation itself, but also that this automated moderation doesn't understand a lot of things, including, of course, context, but beyond context, languages. And one thing that we hope to be able, and that's what I'm working on at the Berkman Klein and also at the Digital Civil Society Lab at Stanford, is how can we make sure that this automated moderation system, understand all the languages possible. At least in our case, we're focusing on West and Central Africa. How can we make sure that they understand not only the languages, but that they understand the context, that they understand that if, for instance, in XYZ country, this person, which has 2 million people followers, says this type of things in this type of event, this should trigger your attention, not 10 days after, but before. So it exists elsewhere. I remember when I was in Paris during the attacks, I barely remember seeing horrible images. And I'm thankful for that, because it would have been very traumatizing. It was already a traumatizing event. It would have been even more if we were to see horrible images of what was happening. But this happens every day. In Cameroon, there is a war. I cannot name a single day when I haven't seen a corpse, the image of a corpse. That's traumatizing. It's on top of a trauma that's already existing. So platforms have to be more proactive, but to do that, they have to work. They cannot, say we'll do it on ourselves. You cannot do it on yourself from London or, San Francisco or elsewhere. You need to work with people who are 10,000 kilometers from where you are, because they know. And you have to do it not when the crisis happens, but before it becomes a crisis.
That's so true. Anyone else want to chime in on that? I want to take one last question, but I want to make room for anyone who wanted to speak on that. Yeah, well, we're almost out of time. I didn't want to end the panel without taking at least one viewer question. So this one comes from YouTube, from Christopher Lawrence. He asks, which will be our final question, what is the role of web media literacy here? It feels like these skills need to be worked on with young minds to grow critical consumers. What do you guys think about that? That's from Christopher Lawrence on YouTube.
Yeah, I think it's very vital. I think a lot of these these skills like media literacy, digital security, I would love to see this, being a part of primary school curricula across the continent, So, even as young as we've done some research, for example, on online gender-based violence, and we're seeing this happening at younger and younger ages. And so that's why I'm advocating that this has to happen as young as primary school, even just when you're 10. And I think that's so vital for countries to put that into their education system. But from what I've seen so far, that we've made very little headway. I don't know, Julie, do you know any examples where this is actually happening, where this is in place?
I remember an example in France, actually, where the government had a program in high schools in which teachers would dedicate some time every week to debunking how to receive information from the internet. And I think that was, I don't have the stats, so I don't know if that was a big success, but I thought it was an interesting example that could be
yeah.
Do you, Camille, any last thoughts?
No, I guess just more media literacy, and even I think even before that, maybe just like critical thinking, because it's not just about what you see on the internet. And actually, this is not too bad of a note to end on, because I think I've been sort of plugging the point the whole panel that the internet is the real world. Like, it almost doesn't make sense to say real world, online, offline anymore, because it is the real world. And so I think critical thinking skills that are taught in general about what content you're consuming can probably help with this more broadly.
I'll make an unpopular point, and I think kind of started making it earlier. Like, of course, I think media literacy is great, and I think that there are parts of media literacy that should be widely taught and much more. But I also do sincerely think that if we overemphasize this as a response to the complexity of what's happening, we're not doing the job of protecting the people who are in the receiving end of something that you don't get out of with more training and knowledge, right? So if you think, for instance, about targeted online harassment and mobs and campaigns, no amount of media literacy alleviates the pain and violence that the targets of online hate bombs are experiencing. And here we kind of need the more enforcement-centric or regulatory responses. So I will say, I think like media literacy always has to come hand in hand with parts of the solution that are not answered by teaching people.
Very true. People do better, government do better, do much better. Okay, cool. Well, I guess we can wrap it there. I want to thank my panelists and their fantastic virtual backgrounds. Next time I'll come through with a better virtual background. I was not prepared. You can follow us on @Mozilla on Twitter, Instagram, all social media. Take care.
Bye.
See you.
Everybody.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you.
Bye.